Why are the events that took place on the morning that the Idaho 4 victims were found so confusing? Hey everyone, it's Lucky with Unfiltered Lucky. And today I want to talk about the strange series of events that took place on the day that the Idaho 4 victims were found. There's a lot of confusion about who found these victims and when they found them. So we've all talked about the 8-hour delay and how there's not really a good explanation for why nobody called 911 for 8 hours after Dylan saw this intruder walk past her bedroom door and exit out of the back of the house. But that was just the beginning of an odd series of events that happened on November the 13th after the Idaho 4 victims were found. A call was made to 911 in Moscow, Idaho for an unconscious person. Both Moscow Police Department and Moscow Fire Department responded to this medical emergency. They received the call at exactly the same time, so keep that in mind as we go along. Moscow Fire Chief Brian Nickerson stated that the call came in just before noon and that they responded immediately with an ambulance and a fire engine. Chief Nickerson states that when Moscow Fire Department arrives at the scene, Moscow Police Department is already there. They've already basically assessed the situation, talked to the individuals who are on scene, and determined that there's no need for medical. So they send Moscow Fire Department away from the scene. Chief Nickerson states that they weren't there very long. Nobody from his team entered the house, and they basically were told by Moscow Police Department that everything was under control and that medical wasn't necessary, so they left. Chief Nickerson says that they didn't do anything. Now, here's what doesn't really make sense about this whole thing. So, when Moscow Fire Department gets to the scene, Moscow Police Department is already there. The call came in as an unconscious person, a medical emergency. So, how long were Moscow Police Department on scene before Moscow Fire Department arrived? They got the call at the exact same time, and Moscow Fire is only 4 minutes away from the King Roadhouse. So, how did Moscow Police Department have time to arrive on scene and assess the situation? How would they know that there was no need for medical? They had only been there for a few minutes. So it seems strange that they would send Moscow Fire Department away from the scene. Chief Nickerson stated that when Moscow Fire arrives at the scene, that Moscow Police Department is talking to individuals who are already there. Maybe the individuals who Dylan and Bethany called over that morning. So it would seem as though these people have already been inside the house and already would know that there were victims inside. I mean, that's why the 911 call was made, right? We've heard that Hunter was called over to the house by Dylan and Bethany, and that he found Ethan and Xana, and that's when he called 911. So it would make sense that he's aware that there's 2 victims who are deceased in this house who have been stabbed to death. So why hasn't Moscow Police Department been informed of this when Moscow Fire Department arrives at the scene? Now, it seems as though Hunter, who is an educated young man, would know what he was looking at. He would know that Ethan and Xana had been attacked with a knife and that they were deceased. They had been deceased for 8 hours. So I feel like he would know the difference between this situation that he's looking at and someone who's unconscious. So why did the call come in to 911 as an unconscious person? Now, a lot of people have said that this 911 operator may have listed the call as an unconscious person because she couldn't understand the caller and sent the call out as a medical emergency, an unconscious person. But we also know that this dispatcher talked to a number of people on the phone during this 911 call. So were they all incoherent? Was everybody that she talked to unable to get the words out that they had just found victims inside this house who were stabbed to death? It doesn't make sense that the call came in as an unconscious person, first of all. But then when law enforcement arrives, it seems as though the people who were in the house, Dylan, Bethany, Hunter, and whoever else was invited over to the house that morning, would run out and tell law enforcement that there's deceased victims inside the house. It seems like if law enforcement has already been to the scene and assessed the situation, talked to the people who were inside the house, it seems as though they would let Moscow Fire Department know that they may need medical help. So it almost seems as though Moscow Police Department may not even know about these victims when Moscow Fire Department arrives. So when was Moscow Police Department made aware of the victims? Or did they show up for an unconscious person and then go in the house and find the victims that the friends who came over that morning had already found? That doesn't make any sense at all. We know that the 911 call was made from one of the roommates' phones. We've heard that this roommate was Dylan. So, if the 911 call was made from Dylan's phone, why wasn't it Dylan that made the call? We know that her phone was used, but it wasn't her who called 911. Why didn't the caller use their own phone? You know, if I walk into a house and I find victims who have been deceased and attacked with a sharp knife, I'm going to pull out my phone and I'm going to call 911. I'm not going to walk around the house and ask if anyone's called 911 yet. I'm going to pull out my phone and call 911 immediately. Why does it seem as though the people who were in the house got together and decided to make this one 911 call at noon? First of all, it takes 8 hours to make the 911 call. Dylan and Bethany call their friends to the house before they even make that 911 call. And then when the 911 call is made, the caller tells the 911 operator that there's someone there who's unconscious, not that there's victims who have been stabbed to death. These are educated young adults that know what they're looking at. These aren't 4-year-olds that don't understand what they're seeing. These are young adults. They know what they're looking at. If they're seeing these victims, then it's quite obvious that they have been stabbed multiple times and that they've been deceased for a period of time. So why wasn't this relayed to the 911 operator? And from the 911 operator to law enforcement and Moscow Fire Department. Everybody shows up at this house thinking that they're going to find somebody who's unconscious. They don't realize that they're going to walk into a house with 4 victims who have been deceased. It doesn't make sense that these students in their early 20s who are educated can't describe to the dispatcher what they're seeing. Instead, they describe it as an unconscious person. Now, is it possible that there was an unconscious person on the property, and that's why somebody called 911? That's very possible. But we only see a single 911 call. And allegedly that was made by Hunter after he discovers Ethan and Xana. But if he makes the call after he's already discovered Ethan and Xana, then he knows what he's looking at. Why would he describe it as something different? When law enforcement, when Moscow Police Department arrives on scene, it seems as though these people in the house who discovered these victims and called 911 would let law enforcement know that this is much more than just someone who is unconscious. So when Moscow Fire Department arrives on scene, it seems as though Moscow Police Department would let them know immediately that this is not a call for someone who is unconscious, but this is something much bigger. This is for individuals inside this house whose lives have been taken with a knife. It would seem at that point that Moscow Fire Department would want to hang around in case one of these victims is possibly clinging to life, or maybe there's somebody else inside this house who may need medical attention. It just seems like a very odd series of events that happened on the morning that the Idaho 4 victims were found. It seems like very odd actions by Dylan and Bethany, the people who were called over to the house that morning. And, we've heard that these people were called over to the house mid-morning. So why wasn't 911 called mid-morning? Why were they not called until noon? So it doesn't appear that there was anyone who was unconscious outside of the King Roadhouse. Because if there were, Moscow PD would definitely turn that over to Moscow Fire Department. Law enforcement are not medical professionals. They would definitely let Moscow Fire Department handle that situation. It also doesn't seem as though they were aware of the victims inside the house when Moscow Fire Department arrived at the scene, because it wouldn't make sense that they would send them away. So there's a lot of confusion, and it almost appears as though this confusion was caused maybe on purpose. Because like I said, these are educated college students. They know what they're looking at. They know how to make a 911 call. They know how to inform law enforcement of what's going on inside the house. So why all of the confusion? It almost appears as though this confusion was intentional. Now, I'm not saying that it was, but it does appear that way. Now, if Brian Koberger did commit these crimes, if a complete stranger committed these crimes, then these people who were inside the house, Bethany, Dylan, Hunter, whoever else was there, basically did this person a favor. Now, why would they do that? I mean, they basically helped this person out by not calling 911 for 8 hours, by confusing the situation as to what was going on at the King Roadhouse. I mean, they basically did whoever committed these crimes a favor. Nothing that happened at 1122 King Road on the morning of November 13th makes any sense. When Moscow Police Department arrives at the King Roadhouse, the University of Idaho puts out a shelter in place. It's a very dangerous situation. A quadruple homicide just happened inside this house just off of campus. So the University of Idaho puts out a shelter in place. But less than an hour later, they lift that shelter in place. So it's very possible, in my opinion, that when law enforcement gets to the King Roadhouse, they know that this crime was focused toward these victims and that nobody else in the community is in danger. So less than an hour later, they lift that shelter in place, and they also tell the community that they're not in danger. It's safe for them to walk outside. Just be vigilant. But the mayor basically comes out and says that that law enforcement believes that this crime was focused toward these victims. So, some very odd things that happened that morning. And it seems as though these students, Dylan and Bethany, and everyone who came over that morning would have known better. That they would have known to call 911. It just doesn't make sense. Let me know what you think in the comments. And thanks for hanging out with me today. I really appreciate it. If you liked my video, please hit the like button and subscribe to my channel. I hope that y'all had a great weekend. We'll see you next time.